Hey everybody, Alexander Diaz here, licensed acupuncturist. So today I want to talk about mass formation psychosis. Right now in the world, there's the greatest expression of tyranny through propaganda and psychological manipulation. Essentially, a mass hypnosis is happening. It is the evolutionary endpoint of the development of totalitarianism throughout the 19th, 20th, and early 21st centuries. It's at its nadir or at its high point. It'll probably continue to increase in terms of the mental colonization of people. And I'm drawing a lot of this data from Matthias Desmet, Del Bigtree on the High Wire. Matthias coined the term mass formation, but it's an extremely important psychological concept, and I know that a lot of my listeners may not be accessing that particular video or that particular body of work, so I'm looking to simply distill and translate the medicine that I got from learning through these folks. So, what ends up happening in mass formation, similar to how communism, to how Nazism, to how the early Catholicism, through radical Islam, radical Hinduism. There's many versions of mass psychosis that leads to psychopathic behaviors or essentially violent mass behaviors. And so the first most important step to create mass psychosis by these propagandists when they want to create it is it arises like disease arises in a condition of toxicity. Mass formation arises in a condition of disconnectedness, loneliness, and a meaningless existence. And there creates a free-floating anxiety among the people, which leads to eventually frustration and aggression. And folks are usually looking for an object to put out their frustrations in terms of having violence as the retributive, cleansing, healing. And what ends up happening is that there's a narrative distributed where there is a scapegoat. So for Nazism, the scapegoat was Jews or the Untermenschen. For communism, it was those who stood against the masses and it was rich people. For Islam, it's disbelievers. And then there's a strategy, which is you limit the rights, jail, and eventually annihilate the group that is supposedly responsible for creating the ill. And the thing about mass formation is it can be completely absurd. And there's a symptomatic experience of control. So what people who have the free-floating anxiety, like folks with OCD, they're looking for something to control. So if I can control the Venetian blinds and make sure they're all at the same level, I feel calm. So folks who have huge systems such as COVID that are out of their control and putting their life at risk in every avenue that they exist in, then they're looking for a way to control that. And so they're looking to create, a mask or a jab or to limit the rights and otherwise annihilate those who are not participatory in essentially the social norm or the anthropologic religious norm that supposedly protects you. And this can continue on into absurdity when all the data, even the data from the very propagandistic mouthpieces, such as the CDC or the VAERS system, are saying that the vaccines don't prevent transmission or getting sick, that people can continue with this belief because it's not about the logic of the belief, it's about control. And it's about having consistency across all the different avenues that you're receiving information from. And if you look at that, there is deep consistency between the media, the so-called scientific or academic establishment, and the biopharmaceutical/medical establishment. There is a consistent message, even though that message is completely wrong. And so what we're seeing now, the new scapegoat, as evidenced in Biden's red-lit speech with the two Marines on either side of him, is that the so-called MAGA Republicans are now the threat to democracy. And so there's a major issue in that up to 85% of psychological research is wrong, and can't be repeated. And this is an issue in science across the board, particularly medical science, where it's almost impossible for colleagues to reproduce the same results of a given study, even with a repeat study with the same exact parameters. And so, in the moment that we have the primary mass formation psychosis, we also have to be very careful to not fall into secondary mass psychoses, such as extreme evangelical Christianity that could itself lead to violence, extreme conspiracy theories which propose that killing a certain group of people is going to solve all the problems. Those themselves are sort of responsive mass psychoses that we also have to avoid. But I want to talk about the primary canon, the primary tenets of the major mass formation psychosis that's going on right now. So one of the primary tenets, abortion is not killing a person. When clearly, I speak to my baby who's in the womb of mama, and she hears me and she starts moving. So that's clearly a person. Another tenet is that the vaccine stops the spread and stops the severity and causes people to have less long-term damage. The data shows that that's false. Another tenet is that general vaccines of all types are not a cause of autism or allergies or immunologic problems, which clearly they are. Another tenet is that gender dysphoria, which is really a psychological problem, is actually more like a proper identity politic that needs to be supported. A tenet is that Ukraine is the good guys and that Russia has no legitimate cause to invade Ukraine. A common tenet is that a dog is a person. And there's a lot of people who insist that a dog is a person. They call it my fur baby. They refer to it as babies, and then they entitle their dog to run around like crazy and abuse and maybe put at danger other people. I've seen this hundreds of times. A common tenet of the mass formation is that the patriarchy, so-called the disgustingness of men, is the root cause of all problems in the world. They say that it's okay for people to lose their jobs if they refuse the vaccine. They say that it's okay to isolate the children and that it won't have long-term deleterious effects on children to put them into lockdown. Canon tenet is that ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine are dangerous and should be refused to all patients, despite 60 years of proven medical efficacy and being listed among some of the safest drugs and having tremendous clinical value in treating COVID and other diseases. A common tenet of the mass formation right now is that you can even identify as another species. So you can be a cat. If you're a human being, you can say, I'm a cat, and I expect to be treated as a cat, and that should be validated by school systems. But you can't say that you identify as another race. So for example, if I was to identify as African, I would be hugely maligned and possibly censored and possibly canceled. But the realistic scientific evidence, at least that I grew up with, is that we all emerged from Africa. So we're all Africans. I mean, look at the twist on this curly hair right here. Canon tenet is that BLM, Black Lives Matter, is a justice-oriented organization rather than a communist front for enabling the enrichment of a few leaders and the destruction of property. They believe that wrath, rage, bigotry, particularly against Jews or against men or against whites, is acceptable, although any other bigotry is unacceptable. They believe that the MAGA people are terrorists and that the January 6th so-called insurrection was one of the worst things ever to happen, even though if you look at all the video, the cops were just letting them in. They were walking around peacefully, most of the people. There was a couple of pieces of violence, which is really unfortunate. They also say that climate change is one of the biggest risks, and that supposedly the COVID lockdowns reduced climate emissions in such an effective way. But if you listen to Randall Carlson and other scientists, what we're looking at is actually we're in a big grace period. We'd be in an ice age right now, were it not for a series of meteor strikes about 12,600 years ago and 11,800 years ago. And so we're actually enjoying an unprecedented nice time when the world would have normally been still in the ice age or still, just emerging from the ice age right now. Um, a common tenet of the major psychosis right now is that the biopharmaceutical complex has our best interests in mind, despite clear evidence of the opioid epidemic, of vaccine harms, and of more than 350,000 US deaths per year because of iatrogenic causes, which means malfeasance, negligence, harm caused by doctors, physicians, hospitals, etc., drugs. A common tenet of the mass psychosis is that having children is actually selfish and bad for the earth, and that we should limit the children we have unto ripping out uteruses, castrating, abortion, various just like kill the children. Children are not a good thing. That's what these folks believe. These folks also seem to believe that the 40% increase in mortality after the vaccines came out versus the time before, particularly among 18 to 64-year-olds, is not related to the jab, and that I've actually heard this from some of my best friends who were caught up in the psychosis, that it's okay for a certain number of people to die, essentially to become sacrificial lambs, so that the rest of people can be properly vaccinated and have the so-called protections. These folks believe that lockdowns were merited, that it was a good thing, and that it prevented the spread of COVID, when the evidence is that it didn't, and countries that didn't lock down had just about the same spread. And they also say that the green politics and the wave of green agenda and climate protection agenda is actually a good thing. What I've noted is that there were about 60 million excess deaths in the world caused by the lockdown, and that the measures that have been taken after the lockdowns, such as in Sri Lanka, in the Netherlands, in Ghana, all across the world, people can't go to school, they have no fuel, their economies are crashing. And this is, first of all, it's not good for the environment, but it's also killing people like crazy. And I think that a lot of the folks who are caught up in this primary mass psychosis believe that it's really okay to sacrifice, particularly these poor people, or these farmers, or these conservative people, that it's really okay to let those folks all die off. And what's amazing to me is that up until this time, we've existed in a brief state of accepting that people deserve life, that life is the first human right. And then liberty, right, and the pursuit of happiness, these have all been shut down. So it's amazing to me the tenets, the Xi Jinping thought, the correct thought that has been adopted through the mass psychosis, when it's completely absurd if you actually just bring it out to the light and look at it. And so there are no comparison studies in terms of vaccine damage that deal with a placebo group. So they didn't test it by giving a placebo, because they said, how can we prevent these individuals from having access to the good stuff? The real vax is the good stuff. So we can't have a placebo group, right? But they haven't even validated studies, like there's no studies done by the biopharmaceutical complex regarding what the impacts are on the vaccinated versus the folks who did refuse it. But as far as I know, as a physician, a clinician, and as I'm looking into this with a lot of depth and listening to a lot of the experts, Peter McCullough, Robert Malone, Mark Sherwood, what I'm finding out is that the vaccinated are by and large suffering much more grievous medical injury than those who refused it. And so what ends up happening with folks who are caught up in this hypnosis is that they have an innate self-protective mechanism where they heap illogic upon illogic upon illogic unto the point where you can't even talk to them about logic, and they're going to shut you down and they're going to attack you. So a really dear friend of mine, world traveler, brilliant photographer, he just said, hey man, how come you didn't get the vaccine? And I said, listen, look into 1 hour of these videos that I'll send you, and I'll watch any video that you want. I'll study anything from your side that you want, and then we'll talk. And he said, I refuse. I'm not going to get into that discussion. And I said, no problem, buddy. I love you anyways. But folks just don't want to hear it, and they can't hear it, because the psychological ramifications of realizing that the system, the anthropologic system and narrative that they've built their consciousness on, and that they've built their sense of safety on, after having this tremendous anxiety and fear, that system is false. Well, this is so impactful, and this is part of the reason we have so much suicide and drug abuse, is because it's very difficult for human beings to maintain this false narrative. It costs them, and they have to numb themselves, and that's part of why like 1 in 3 Americans is on a psych med, and why addiction is so high. And so people's academic career and scientific career, medical career, is often based on upholding the narrative, even when they don't believe that it's the right thing. But what ends up happening is it creeps in and it creeps in and it creeps in, and they're like, now I support the narrative, because what they're really doing is supporting their livelihood. And so folks get duped into thinking this. It happens in all the totalitarian systems throughout history. It's the same thing. And what this does is it provides people an opportunity to express their innate pathos, in other words, to be hateful. And, I've had people scream at me and curse at me, and I'm just thinking to myself, when in my life has this ever happened? I wasn't wearing a mask in the gym after the mask mandates were over, and this lady just starts screaming curses at me. Don't you care? What if somebody has cancer? And I'm just thinking to myself, who is this lady? Like, wouldn't she be afraid of like a young man who's obviously doing kung fu? I mean, I'm never going to be a threat to her. I'd never hurt her. I told her I pray for her. But it's just amazing that the latent pathos and misanthropy of people is able to now be expressed and given free rein. The thing is, people fear uncertainty. Normally, the human mind is based on language signs, and these are multi-referential, so it's hard to define one term without using other languages, without using other words. And so there's no unifying explanation that provides a really common, like, here's the worldview that you can be certain in. So we exist in a vast existential uncertainty, and the propagandists who are in control play on that by providing a science as a dogma, as essentially as a deity dogma. And we get looped into thinking that. But what ends up happening is that science is no longer science, it's just the religion. And so they tore down the religion, replaced it with science, and now you can't go against like so-called scientifically proven things, even though science is constantly coming up with new ideas and new data, and constantly realizing that it was wrong. And so what we need to do is actually bring people back into love and light and trust, and we need to welcome them. We don't need to conquer their logic, and we don't need to prove to them anything. They're not even receptive when they're caught up in this mass psychosis. But rather, we need to bring them into a space of like, welcome back to love. Welcome back to trust. I had a dear friend of mine who's clearly caught up in this psychosis, who at one point called me a bioterrorist because I was giving people hugs during COVID. And when he came to visit most recently, he wasn't even able to bring himself to sit at the dinner table with my baby son and my wife. And I said, come sit at the dinner table. Let's hug. Let's visit people. And I could see it was cracking into his armor, and he was opening up and becoming more vulnerable. And, he wasn't really receptive to the logic. He wasn't really receptive to data. He had his views, which were propagandized views. But I think I chose the correct route, which is the underneath, which is bringing people back to love. And we essentially have to support people. In my case, I particularly want to support young men who are the most despondent, but who are potentially the most exciting and productive new members of society. That there is a grand adventure, and that what is life about? It's about the stewardship of the planet, it's about the stewardship of culture, it's about the stewardship and promulgation and advancement of wisdom traditions, generation to generation, that we are bridges, that we can accept the finitude of our lives, and we can have gratitude for every day that we have and breathe and feel God in your heart. And so that's what I'm advocating. It would be a big mistake, and I've made this mistake, to hate on people because they're caught up in the mass formation. People getting caught up in it is just because they're psychologically weak, and just because they haven't had the resilience of a good civics education, and because they don't have a meditative practice, or because they don't have the wisdom to see through this delusion, and also because they might not have been understanding the level of propagandizing and the history of horrible harms that were done by the mass psychoses and the creation of propaganda and of hypnosis. But I do have those. But instead of hating on the people or normalizing or or ostracizing those who have that view. What I try to do is just love them. And if they can't love me back or they're scared, it's like, hey, whatever. They're just psychotic. They're not evil. They're just psychotic. And so if you think of it like that, especially as a physician or a healer, it really gives a lot more peace. And it's like, okay, so they're caught up in that. And, the moment that they really start oppressing me or really start trying to put me in camps, well, we have the correct response to that kind of stuff, if you know what I'm saying. And so that's what I'm really advocating. I would recommend look into Matthias Desmet, look into Del Bigtree, learn, read, but more importantly, open your heart, love, share meals, share time. We're safe. This disease is not going to get us. Almost everyone has had it already. If you're not vaccinated, you probably have had it. If you are vaccinated, you probably have had it. We have some natural immunity. And you can look at also my videos on herbal medicine and how to properly treat COVID. I also recommend Dr. Zelenko. Excellent doctor, he just passed, but his data on how to treat the COVID is most accurate. And Frontline Critical Care Consortium, so FLCCC, tremendous website, tremendous data. Just remembering, hold light in your heart. This is a brief candle flicker. This is a brief moment, this light, so fill your heart with love. And I just want to wish prayers and blessings to everyone. Thank you so much for listening.